The year was 1869. Her name was Mary Rote. She arrived by steamboat at Ovid Landing, shackled at the wrists and transported by 2 armed guards. Mary Rote had spent the previous 10 years chained to a wall in Madison County, New York, often naked and suspended by her thumbs. Described as deformed and demented, she would become Willard Insane Asylum's first patient. 127 years later, in 1996, the Willard Insane Asylum would finally shutter its doors, whereupon a horrifying discovery was made. Buried near the facility were over 5,700 bodies, lying in unmarked graves, all former Willard patients. Drawing upon confidential hospital archives, private patient letters, and newspaper accounts of the day, I will now take you on a journey inside a world of madness. What terrible secrets were uncovered at Rolling Hills Asylum? Who was the gravedigger Lawrence, and what was found buried near the Rochester Insane Asylum? What happened to the beautiful Nellie Bly inside the lunatic asylum on Blackwell Island? What was the notorious device the Utica crib used for? And who haunts the Buffalo Insane Asylum even to this day? Shocking tales of neglect, abuse, and even torture will be revealed here, some for the first time. But also, we will hear of remarkable stories of inspiration, hope, and healing. Welcome to Madhouse. The first evidence we have of man's attempt to treat mental illness was found in human skulls dating back 7,000 years ago. Holes had been chipped into the skulls with the use of crude stone axes and chisels, so that evil spirits that came to reside in the minds of the insane could be released. This belief that insanity was the result of supernatural forces would continue for the next 5,000 years, until the brilliant Greek physician and philosopher Hippocrates would posit that demons were not the cause of insanity, but that it was a medical condition requiring treatment. Hippocrates formulated what would become known as the Hippocratic Oath, whose central tenet was interpreted to be, first, do no harm. The first insane asylum was established in, of all places, Baghdad, Iraq, in 730 A.D. The first asylum in the English-speaking world was the Royal Hospital of Bethlehem, that was established in 1230. The word Bedlam is derived from its name. God only knows what transpired behind its stone walls. Discharged patients were called Bedlamites, and they were licensed to beg along the main road. Tickets were actually sold for the citizens to see the mad. Today, the hospital is a research facility. The first asylum in the New World was the York Retreat. It was founded in 1792 by the Society of Friends, a Quaker, the model for the humane treatment of the mentally ill, and became known as moral treatment. It would dominate the treatment of mental health care for the next 100 years. Perhaps the first individual to address the plight of the mentally ill was a woman by the name of Dorothea Lynn Dix. She was born to a mentally ill mother and an abusive and violent alcoholic father. She would spend 40 years of her life working for better care for the insane and the poor. She would be responsible for the establishment of 32 mental hospitals 15 schools for the feeble-minded, and numerous training facilities for nurses and libraries and prisons. Before she died, Dix was asked why she hadn't allowed any of these institutions to be named after her. She was reported to have said, "Let my work speak for itself. Let it rest in silence." The person, though, perhaps most responsible for the change in the treatment of the insane was the physician, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. Although desiring to become a surgeon, he was not admitted into the Pennsylvania Surgeons and Medical Hospital in Philadelphia, so he used his family connections to become the superintendent of the Quaker Friends Asylum for the Insane. Although continuing to long for the more prestigious profession of surgeon, Kirkbride would go on to spend the next 40 years of his life working for the insane. During his career, Kirkbride wasn't so much interested or involved in the various types of therapies that were applied to the mentally ill, but his efforts went into designing the actual buildings themselves that housed the patients and staff. Kirkbride envisioned a hospital environment that by its very construction would have a curative effect on patients, with its exposure to fresh air, natural light, nutritious food, clean water, and views of farmland. It would allow patients to work in gardens, taking part in games, outdoor recreation, and help foster and maintain social and occupational skills. The buildings themselves would be 3 stories tall, with a wing for men and a separate wing for women. Administrative offices were to be on the first floor. The less ill would be on the second, and the more seriously ill on the third. Eventually, 200 Kirkbride buildings would be built. Most now lie empty and deteriorating due to neglect. Many have been demolished and are rapidly vanishing, signaling an end to a remarkable period in the history of mental health care. But it is these buildings, the people who served in them, the patients who were treated in them, the madhouses of the day, that shaped the hidden history of insane asylums in 19th century New York. The raving maniac, the young child, the infirmed old man, and the seducer's victim. In 1824, New York State commissioned a study to look into the living conditions of the insane. What they found was horrendous. Those living in rural areas inhabited farmhouse cellars, lived under bridges and barns, or actually in the wild. Those living in the cities slept in alleyways, doorways, and even in sewers. They lived in packing boxes, on barges, and on piles of rubbish. They begged for their food and often were victims of early death by disease and violence. New York State mandated that poorhouses were to be established in every county of New York. And it is from these poorhouses that the large insane asylums would eventually be created, such as Old Main, the New York Insane Asylum at Utica. It was New York's first state-run facility designed for the mentally ill, and one of the first in the United States. Dr. Uriah Brigham was the first director, and he was also influenced by Kirkbride. Old Main had a number of notable achievements. The Opal was established, which was a newsletter for the patients and staff. They initially called it the American Journal of Insanity. It was written and edited by patients. They contributed poetry, articles, and essays. Common themes were politics, insanity, confinement, liberty, and human rights. Years later, The publication would eventually become accepted by professionals and would be named the American Journal of Psychiatry. Old Main would also become known as the inventor of a device called the Utica crib. The Utica crib was used to restrain adult patients. These Utica cribs were long, narrow, and from 15 to 30 inches high, with slats for the sides, the top, and sometimes the bottom. The person restrained could neither sit up nor get out. Director Brigham once wrote, "One female in a crib was very impatient, violent, and abusive towards the matron. Still, she appeared physically comfortable." The director did not mention the possibility that being locked in such a cage for hours and days might cause both physical and mental distress. On the contrary, he applauded the officers and the attendants of the institution for being faithful and attentive to their duties. John Halverson was 37 when he was first restrained in a Utica crib in 1867 because he tried to escape. For a while, in the early 1870s, he was restrained only with wristlets. But starting in 1872, he was kept in the crib most of the time. The note for June 1st, 1873, in his record read, "Noisy as ever, lower limbs flexed so that knees are drawn up to his chin, crawls about on his buttocks and hands, fierce and noisy." The entries for June 1874 and March 1875 are no change. In December of 1875, a visiting institution superintendent said he was favorably impressed at seeing so few persons there in mechanical restraints. For John, however, the damage had been done. A note in his file from March 1876 says, "Can't walk, but is much quieter." He was a veteran of the Royal Austrian Army. He claimed to hear the voice of God and be able to see angels. He developed a very necessary skill while at Willard. He became the primary grave digger, and during his career, he dug over 900 graves. When Lawrence died, he himself was buried in an unmarked grave. The beautiful Nellie Bly and the lunatic asylum on Blackwell Island. Nellie Bly was a reporter, and she had heard rumors that the lunatic asylum on Blackwell Island was a notorious destination for the insane and that they were being mistreated. So she went to investigate. And in order to do so, she feigned insanity so she could actually become committed to the asylum. After 3 days, she had determined that she had seen enough and had told the authorities that she felt fine and wanted to go home. There, by the way, lies a cautionary tale. If you ever find yourself locked up in an insane asylum, of course, through no fault of your own, don't tell the authorities you feel fine and want to go home. Tell them you feel better and hope to go home soon. But as the result of her expose, legislation was actually enacted. Her experiences would be chronicled in a book titled 10 Days in a Madhouse. And as a result of this work, Nellie Bly would be inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, New York. The Female Hunter of Delaware County and the Binghamton Asylum for the Chronic Insane. Lucy Ann Lobdell was not your average girl. She could work as hard as any man. She rode a horse as well as any man. and she shot a gun better than any man. But Lucy also dressed as a man. In fact, for 60 years of her life, she lived as a man, and she went by the name of Joe, and she actually married a woman by the name of Mary. Today, we would label her as a lesbian or perhaps more accurately, transgendered. Endured forced marriage, arrest, and eventually she was evaluated by a physician who determined that Lucy Ann Lobdell was lucid in thought, was clear, coherent in speech, not confused, not erratic. But incredibly, though, she was found to be delusional and committed to the Willard Asylum and then later the Binghamton Asylum for the Insane, where she would spend the last 33 years of her life for only insisting that she was a man. The most infamous ghost story surrounding the Buffalo State Asylum involved the case of Sadie McMullen and is known as Halloween at Murder Creek. As the story goes, on Halloween night of 1890, Sadie McMullen, in a fit of insane rage, threw two children, Delia Brown, age 6, and Nellie Mae Connors, age 8, off of the railroad bridge that spanned Murder Creek in Akron, New York. Sadie then attempted to take her own life by jumping from the bridge. Connors died, but Delia survived, and according to testimony, she said to the rescuers who found her, "Sarah thought she was really smart to throw us off the bridge, didn't she?" What exactly the little girl meant by those words remains a mystery. Sadie McMullen survived as well. And had Sadie been convicted of murder, she would have been the first woman to be put to death in New York using the recently introduced electric chair. She eventually went to trial for murder, but was found not guilty by reasons of insanity. She was committed to the Buffalo State Asylum, but for only 2 years. Afterwards, she was released. She vanished without a trace and was never seen or heard from again. Or was she? According to area legend, the ghost of Sadie McMullen returns every Halloween night with little Nellie Mae Connors, and they now stalk the abandoned corridors of the Buffalo State Asylum. The Hudson River Asylum for the Insane. This place is downright spooky. Stephen King spooky. Beyond Stephen King spooky. More like Edgar Allan Poe meets Bram Stoker spooky. Sitting on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, spellbinding for its high Victorian Gothic architecture, what once was the Hudson River Asylum for the Insane is now best described as the place to be on Halloween. It is said that screams and loud noises can be heard on the grounds after dark. There are also reports of a large orb that chases people around and sightings of apparitions wandering the area. Abandoned since 2003, its most striking feature may be the small red and white sign nailed to a stake in the ground at the edge of the property. The stake and sign reads, "For sale by owner." There are no takers. Frederick Moors, an Austrian immigrant, has the unique distinction of having been a patient in 3 of New York's insane asylums. His tale is a cautionary one. Frederick Moores immigrated to the United States and settled in New York City. Assuming the name Frederick Moores, he soon found employment at the German Old Fellows' Home in the Bronx as an orderly. Almost immediately, Moores began acting in a strange manner. Moores may have begun killing soon after his arrival at the home, but nothing was suspected for 6 months. But soon, many suspicious deaths of elderly patients began to occur. Moores was confronted and immediately confessed. Without hesitation, Moores admitted he had perfected a method of dispensing chloroform poisoning. He stated he had done so in order to put the old folks out of their misery and make room for others in the crowded home. Moores went on to say he had killed approximately 17 patients in that manner. Upon his confession, Moores was sent to Bellevue Hospital for a mental evaluation. The evaluation revealed him to be not well mentally, and he was committed to the Hudson River Hospital for the Insane for a further examination. While at Hudson River, he was found by the jury to be criminally insane and was committed to the Madhouse Hospital for the criminally insane. After several years at Madhouse, Moores escaped. It was said that he just walked away. Moores was never caught, but authorities appeared to take his escape in stride, stating he was not considered dangerous. Moores, as far as we know, disappeared into obscurity, never to be heard from again. Spooky. She is known simply as Miss X. Presumably, she had a name at one time. Presumably, she had a family, a childhood, and a life. And then at the age estimated to be around 13, she was dropped off at an asylum by persons unknown, where she would spend the rest of her life. The year was 1885. Incredibly, Miss X would remain a patient for the next 73 years. She, of course, could not know that her life would span profound changes in the care of the mentally ill. Notes written in longhand and attached to her yellowed admission papers report, "She has seemed peculiar all of her life. Always solitary, very quiet, never in play with other children. Worries over food, thinks she is covered with bugs, insists that there's a river to cross, thinks her mother is against her. From lack of adequate treatment, her condition worsened. Very disorderly and untidy, nervous, and tears at her clothing. 70 years after her admission, and now 83 years of age, Miss X was described as a shrunken little woman, a pitiful wretch, and a chronic bystander to a life gone by. There was no celebration of her 70th anniversary at the asylum. Miss X just sat rocking in her chair. Miss X's life bridged a remarkable period from the age of asylum building to the age of deinstitutionalization. The implosion of the insane asylum would begin in the late 1800s, initially constructed to house only 60 patients. The patient-to-staff ratio was very high. But as the asylums became better known and people more comfortable with placing their family members in the institutions, the typical population would increase from 60 to as many as 600, and then later in the 20th century to as many as 6,000. In fact, the Pilgrim State Mental Health Facility in Long Island, at its apex, housed over 16,000 patients. And at that point, treatment became more custodial. Restraints were used. Neglect became rampant. And then abuse. And then some would say even torture. Miss X bridges this span of the height of the asylum building to the Community Health Center Act. There became a progressive movement where forced restraints, such as the Utica crib and the holding chair, were beginning to be phased out. Forced castration would begin in 1913 and wasn't abolished until 1961. Drug-induced comas were used, lobotomies, electroshock therapy, straitjackets, and psychotropic medications were used extensively. And then Congress began an investigation somewhat similar to what New York State had done 140 years earlier, where Congress issued a report in 1948 that they found that more money needed to be spent on the care of the mentally ill. And so spending doubled. The first psychiatric social workers were hired. The first discharge plans were used. Some patients had to be acquainted with modern conveniences. Outpatient treatment would begin in 1951. In 1955, the first psychotropic drugs were developed. And under John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1963, the Community Mental Health Center Act was instituted. At that point, large state mental health hospitals began scaling back on inpatient services. In 1974, Social Security Disability Program was implemented, and professional staff were increased. Beginning in the 1980s, managed care began to oversee the use of hospitalizations. The length of inpatient stays begins to decrease dramatically. The civil rights of psychiatric patients comes to the fore in the 1990s, and groups form to stop forced commitments. Today, many former mental health patients don't look upon themselves as the beneficiaries of these changes, but as survivors of this system. The process of deinstitutionalization begins in earnest in the mid-1990s and continues to this day. Many of the large psychiatric institutions chronicled in the book Madhouse have now closed. Ironically, and perhaps sadly, homelessness and the total lack of treatment has now been reported. In effect, society has come full circle on the treatment of the insane. And what should we do about that? I think I will leave that to you. Miss X is long gone from this world now, but her 73 years of hospitalization certainly deserve our attention and even respect. Maybe in an odd way, Miss X had the last laugh, as 13 of the 15 institutions we explored in the book have closed their doors before she died. In effect, she outlasted them. No record exists for the death of the patient, simply known as Miss X. But it's likely that her remains, along with the gravedigger Lawrence, Willard's first patient, Mary Rote, and the female hunter of Delaware County, now reside in a long-forgotten cemetery of a madhouse. And may they rest in peace.